Okie dokie, it is 10, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Debbie, I can see you're writing your last name, so you're good. Come on in. And today is one of our more fun days. So today we are going to start talking about intelligence tests more specifically. So I have rated our archive, and I have, I think, 5 different intelligence tests I can show you materials from. So this makes it a really fun day. Probably Friday, but if not Friday, Monday, we will be getting into pairs and y'all will be giving each other a mini intelligence test, basically. It's sort of a neuropsych test. So I will send an email about this too, but everyone should try to be here in person Friday and Monday, because it might take us both days. It does take a little bit to get through it, and then you're gonna have to switch it. The other person's gonna have to give it. So do try to be here in person those days, because this is not something that will work over Zoom. So, and I've noticed that there's a little bit of Friday creep, so just a reminder to have folks come in then. So today we should, I think, get through talking about all the intelligence tests, and then Wednesday we should be able to talk about neuropsych assessment. And I know a couple of you are in my neuropsych class, so some of that will be reviewed for you. Alrighty, so I am going to go ahead and share screen. And when I demonstrate the materials, I'll try to also like hold them up to the camera so folks who have to be remote today can see them. Alrighty. Okay. you've heard me mention these a lot. These are the Wechsler scales. These are the ones that I was taught to use, that really are the gold standard in this day and age. And so therefore are used the most often by most institutions. So when I worked at my training clinic, when I worked at the hospital for my placement year, when I worked at the VA, and a different hospital for my residency or internship year, they all use the Wechsler scales. So these really are the most commonly used. These are what you would expect to see were you to have to take a test with someone. This is also what you would expect to see were you to be training to give. But before we get into those, I remembered I do have one of the tests we talked about on Friday. So this, as you can see, sort of an ancient artifact. It's in like a carved wood box here. So this is an original Stamford Binet, the revision. So let me see if it has a copyright. Copyright 1937. So give you a little bit of a feel for what this looks like. So this was the scoring sheet that the examiner would use as they went through. So you can see it had some things that the examiner might need to like indicate stuff on. It has lists of items as you go through, and show you some of the materials here, because this one's super fun. There's like a little puzzle you would have them do. When I say this is like an ancient artifact, like it's falling apart because it's from 1937. Yeah. Diagram where you have them talk about the human body. There's something kind of like block design that we'll talk about on the Wechsler scales. Blocks you would have them interact with. And then there are also these adorable little toys. There's a little sleeping cats and some cars, trains. There are little cups in here. There we go. And then there's also bead stringing here. And looks like you would have them kind of almost do like origami somehow. I've never been trained in this set, so I have always, when I pull it back out, I'm always like, what is this? It's like, again, finding an ancient artifact. So, but that gives you a little bit of a feel for what these materials used to look like, what the Stamford Binet looks like. I think these are just more of the testing books. Yeah. So these were donated by a former VW site professor, Don Wolfgang. He was a clinician and he actually practiced, unlike. So that's a Stamford Binet. And then I have a version of at least every form of the Wechsler scales. So we'll be able to look at those as we go through. So I have a whisk, I have a whipsy, and I have two different waisters. So. All right, so let's talk about the scales in general first. All righty, so he, as we mentioned on Friday, really designed this for adults initially, and that was unusual because prior to this, Binet, Stanford, all those other guys in France were really interested in looking at kiddos, right? Looking at kids and figuring out, which kids might need essentially like more help. They were kind of looking at learning disabilities before they really had the terminology for it. So these, I just realized you don't have the PowerPoint on. That's helpful. Wow.
I thought that was on purpose.
No, I'm being mysterious. No, I just forgot to turn it on because I didn't lecture in the class before this, and I usually turn it on then. So the people who are remote see the PowerPoint, but that's okay. Y'all have access to this anyway on Blackboard, but I'll get it up to make it a little easier here. There we go. All right, so again, design, yeah, that has been like attacking people, so feel free to either pull the blinds up or close the window if you're cold. So the items were chosen to yield clinical information, so things that will tell you about, might this person have some sort of diagnosis we need to look at? And initially, the Wechsler scales did have some sort of weird scoring. I learned about this like once in grad school, and I was like, what the hell is this? I never actually used it because no one does anymore. But it was also like a personality test embedded in it. Like no one uses that anymore. But that's some of the clinical information that was in there too. So it allowed us to look at mental deterioration in the aging population, so people with dementia and even just normal aging, forgetting, things along those lines. So that was novel. And then it had both verbal scales and nonverbal or performance scales. And it used a point scale rather than an age scale. So if you remember on Friday, we talked about like that chronological versus mental age. This is just like, you get points on the test, and that tells us your IQ score, which like, I think makes a lot more intuitive sense to most of us, right? Alrighty, so what it says at the top, which I think is getting cut off, is the point scale concept, the point scale concept. In an age scale, items are grouped by difficulty level, not by content of items. So you might do, so like on the Stamford, the answer form has like year 2, and then a whole bunch of items that might be unrelated, but that they expect someone in 2nd grade to be able to do. Age scale? So that is an age scale, yeah. But what the Wechsler uses is the point scale. Okay. Yep. Yeah, so that's an age scale where you'd be like, okay, kids in 2nd grade should be able to do this. So we'll put all the items for 2nd graders together. So on a point scale, credits are assigned to each item. So each item is worth X amount of points, right? And then you get the points for those items regardless of your age, right? And you get the opportunity to do as many items as you want, regardless of your age. So you start on all of these scales at a certain point. If you start off doing poorly, you can go backwards and like do some remedial ones to see if that makes you more comfortable and you go forwards. Or you can just keep going forwards. And all of the subsections have what are called like stop rules. So basically, if the person gets X number wrong in a row, you stop. You don't want to like really overwhelm them, make them feel disheartened. And so, but based on the answers you answer correctly, you get points. And to be perfectly honest, some of these items are designed to be ridiculously difficult, where only a very small percentage of people are going to be able to answer them. And so you can get a very good IQ score and not answer like 10 of the items on one of the subscales because they're just meant to be that hard. So the items are grouped by content here. So they're, and we'll talk about this as we go through the examples on the test, but they are essentially like all of the items that ask about vocabulary, you do together. All the items that ask about math, you do together. All the items that ask you to build something with these blocks, you do together. So that kind of helps, just because once you're in that frame of mind, right, it's easier to keep doing those same types of questions. That's why I always put like all the multiple choice questions together on an exam, because then you're in that mindset. Then there's the index concept. So when we do studies and we look at, we take all the items, people's scores on all the items, we can enter them into a statistical program and do what's called factor analysis, where it will group items together that like everybody who seems to do well on this item is also doing well on these other items, basically. And they haven't really supported the idea that the best way to view intelligence is those original two components, the verbal and performance, or verbal and nonverbal. Instead, they recommend other ways of looking at it. So we used to just have verbal IQ, performance IQ, and full scale IQ. So that's what the VIQ, PIQ, and FSIQ. Verbal, performance, full scale. More modern versions of the WAIS, starting a little bit with 3, but certainly evolving as they got to the WAIS 4, look at different things. They have subtests grouped into index scores, and there are always at least 4 of those index scores now, including processing speed, and there's like a fluid intelligence one that I'm not remembering the name for, but we'll get to in a few slides. And so it gives you a lot more information, but you can always also get a full scale IQ, because like if someone who's not that familiar with how to do psychological testing requests IQ testing, typically that's the number they're going to care about. Alrighty, so I have the info for the WAIS 3 up here, even though it's super up to date, for a couple of reasons. One is it's what I looked up, and 2 is I think it's good to compare sort of the most recent iteration with the one right before it. So yes, I think I've mentioned to you all before how expensive these are. I think WAISes are about $2,500. And it's like a little more if you want the fancy briefcase. You'll see when we get to the WAIS 4, which I had the school to buy for me, it's just in a box because like I didn't need to pay the extra money for that. So showing the folks online, it's in this fancy briefcase. And this would be helpful if you were someone who like you're a school psychologist and you have to go to different schools, right, to test the kids, or you're someone who travels between different clinics to do it. So everything you need is in this case, and there are a couple different forms that are really helpful in here. So this is your answer form. Again, there we go. Has where you mark the responses for each individual subtest. And so this tells you a lot of what you need to know. So it tells you there's like an arrow that tells you which item to start on for each subtest. And then there's always an indication like, do I need to time them? Is there, like if I start at 6 and they mess that one up, do I go backwards, what they call the reverse rule? And is there a discontinue rule? So, and in this case, the first one, picture completion. If they got 0s on 5 items in a row, then you stop. They're not going to magically start getting the harder ones after that. And so each one has that. And actually, since this is out of date, I can pass this around. I can take a look at what this might look like. So you would have this as the examiner, and the client wouldn't necessarily see it. In fact, shouldn't see it. And one of the ways you make sure they don't see it is with the administration scoring manual. So this is a script, basically, in addition to giving you general information about the test. Anything that's in blue font is what you read word for word to the client. So I'm asking you to do a number of things today, like giving some word definitions and solving a few number problems. You may find some of these tests easy, or others may be more difficult. Also, most people don't answer every question correctly or finish every item, but please give your best effort on all the items. Do you have any questions? And then for each test, there are directions, including sometimes you walk them through samples. And what's really cool, and it's like a stupid little design thing, but it makes all the difference in the world, is this bend is purposely made so you can set it up like that. You put your scoring form behind it, and then the client can't see it. I think I've mentioned to you all before that giving an intelligence test is more challenging than taking one, like by far. So as I mentioned, sometimes you're having to time them, right? And you're keeping track of the manual, the scoring sheet, and then sometimes you also have additional materials you're working with. So for picture completion, that first one, it's about finding what's missing in the picture, what would complete it. So like, this is one of the super easy ones, obviously. What's missing in this picture? Yeah, one of the teeth, right, of the comb. So then they get harder. Show you my favorite one if I can find it. Because this one is like nearly impossible. Yeah, it used to be the hardest one. So show it to my people. Can anyone tell what might be missing in this picture? It might be hard to see too. It's a picture of a barn in the snow, some firewood outside of it, a fence, some trees. Yeah, here people are saying door, smoke, opening toward the fence. There is a gate up here, which you might not be able to see from back there. So I'm not gonna, because again, this one's like nearly impossible. So this is actually, the firewood doesn't have any snow on it, so it's missing footprints that would go to it. Again, like, we are not expecting every person to actually complete that, right? I don't know if I ever even got a client who got to this picture because of that discontinued rule, right? You do 5 zeros and they're out because they're tough before that too. So sometimes you're managing that, for example, and actually let me get the answer. Yes. There are sometimes you have to query it for some of the things. So for example, if they just name the object, like if that first one, they're like, this is a comb. You get to say, yes, but what's missing? And you can give them other prompts, but what is the most important part that is missing? And then you have answers, acceptable answers, essentially, and you get to score based on that. So that one's a 1 or a 0. So I'm going to kind of be bopping back and forth between these lists just because the waste doesn't go like all verbal, all performance. It kind of mixes them up. So the next thing after that is vocabulary. And this is just definitions. You're having the people give you definitions. And so you say, and it has, although like most people don't feel the need to actually like look at these, but it can help. It has the words written out, just in case like they couldn't understand your accent or something. So like, I have had an experience doing a assessment of someone on the spinal cord injury unit when I was on my residency. And I said, okay, sir, where are you from? And he said, Urshville. I started like writing that out phonetically, like I-R-S-C-H. And luckily, my supervisor was with me and he was from the South and he said, oh, Asheville. Okay, so this could be helpful, right? Depending. But then I would say, it tells you, point to the word winter and say, let's start with the word winter. Tell me what winter means. And then they give you a definition. And then, as you can see, there's a whole bunch of options that help you figure out how to score it. So if they say like the cold season, or they say the months it is, or anything like that, that would get you 2 points. If they just say like a season, you get to query them, which the prompt is, tell me more about it, or explain what you mean, to try to get them to the 2 points. And then 0 points would just be if they said something like climate. Do you have a question? Oh, distracted, cool. I thought so, but I thought just in case. So again, those get harder, and you get up to words like encumber or audacious, right? And again, not everybody might get to all of those. Digit symbol coding. Is there are, is the right one? No, I think this is symbol search. Digit symbol coding is actually on the example sheet that I'm passing around, but I have another copy. So it looks like this, and you walk them through it. Basically, they have some sample items, and then you have them do like a test as well. So just to make sure they understand it. So you have them, basically, there's a symbol under every number, and down here, there are numbers, but not in order. So they have to write the symbol that matches that number up here, down here. So, you know, it would be like upside down T / backward C. They can't go through and just do all the ones, right? That would be easy. This is kind of a test of visual memory and processing speed. So you just have them go, and I think you give them 2 minutes, and you have them see how far they can get. I never had anyone finish it. But again, I'm sure if someone has like the highest IQ ever, they might, right? So that is digit symbol coding. Then you would get to similarities. This is very much like the SAT, and it's kind of like analogies a little bit. And so you give them words, and you say, in this section, I'm going to read 2 words to you, and I want you to tell me how they are alike. In what way, the first words are piano and drum. In what way are a piano and a drum alike? And so you're looking at, for some answer, like they're both musical instruments, right? So there again, like vocabulary, different responses that might get 1 point, or you can query to try to get them to 2 points. And again, those get harder as well, as you might expect. So you get to the end, and it's like, in what way are an enemy and a friend alike? And there you're looking for people you have strong feelings for, relationships, things like that. Then you get to do block design. Block design is one of my favorites, because for no other reason, it's been on every version of the Wechsler Scales that they've ever made. So that's really cool. All right. So block design, they have a diagram that they have to build, and they have to build it using these blocks. So each block is red on one side, white on another side, and then half red, half white on the diagonal on some sides. So, for example, for this picture, right, I can make the diagonals of the triangle top by using these, right, and then these would just be solid red ones. You time them on this, and again, the designs get harder. You start with 4 blocks and you work your way up to 9. So then they're creating more elaborate pictures. And at the end, there are actually not lines around it. So then they have to figure out, where does this start and stop? So that one's fun. When I was, I think, a 3rd year, maybe a 2nd year, I was helping out our clinic director by being like his TA for training students on how to give this. And so he gave me a script. And then I just followed it, and some I was supposed to get wrong and some I was supposed to get right. And I had to do one of the 9 blocks of these, and I had done it. I think there were 15 of them. And so by the time I got to my friend Rob, I had done it 14 times already. I think he was last. And so I put it together in like under 30 seconds. And he's like, whoa. I'm like, practice effects, like it's not just me. So, you know, you definitely, this is one of the reasons why we can't just give people it repeatedly. Other things you have them do are arithmetic. The tricky thing about arithmetic is you have them do it out loud. They can't have scrap paper. So they start with pretty easy questions like, how much is $4 plus $5? Right, it's supposed to be $9. And then they get to like pretty elaborate probability questions. When we were learning to give this, we had to give it to someone we know. And so I gave it to my then boyfriend, now husband. And he was a math major. So he, like, you have to time these, and he would finish answering it before I could, like, start and stop the stopwatch. He was so fast. And I was like, yeah, okay. But it's also fun to have that, because sometimes he'll be like, I'm so stupid. And I'm like, no, remember, we know. From 2005, you are not. And he's like, I hate that you have that over me. Let me see. Then we have, gosh, I've forgotten about one of the ones that's coming up. But then we have matrix reasoning. That's another one that's in here. And this is basically finish the puzzle. So the first sample one is obviously really easy. You put the yellow one in, right? And then it gets to, like, how do you finish this sequence? Well, it's big circle, little circle. Okay, we use a little circle. And then it gets to much more complex ones, like trying to figure out how to finish that pattern from one of the ones on the bottom. And this is loosely based on something called Raven's progressive matrices, which are a nonverbal test of intelligence. Digit span. You guys will actually do a version of this, I think, on the neuropsych test you give. But you give them numbers, and they have to repeat them back to you in sequence. So, for example, it starts with just 2 items, like 1, 7, and you leave a second in between each. But then it gets up to sequences of 9 digits, right? And very few people can remember and spit those back at you. And then you do digits backwards, where you would say 2, 4, and they'd have to say 4, 2. And again, that climbs up in length. And for this one, if there are 2 at each length, and if they get both wrong in any of the lengths, that's your discontinual. People get pretty frustrated with this one, as you can imagine. Then there's information, which is like facts. So, like, what direction does the sun rise? Who was Mahatma Gandhi? Things along those lines. And this is, I think, the test that probably has the most cultural bias, right? Because it's things that you would learn in an American high school type thing. Then you have picture arrangement. They got rid of this one on the most recent one, and thank God, because this is one of the ones that was, like, most difficult to do. So there are pictures, and essentially they put them into a comic strip. And so on the back, there are numbers, and that's the order you lay them down in as the examiner. So 1, 2, 3. And then the other thing that's really helpful is that when you pick them up, if they put them in the right sequence, there are also letters over here, and they should spell a word. So in this case, it's cap. This one, yeah, was a pain in the tuchus to give, so I'm not super sad they got rid of that one. Then there's comprehension, where you ask more abstract thought questions like, why do people wash clothes? Or tell me some of the reasons we have a parole system. Or they get to sayings at the end. What does this saying mean? Shallow brooks are noisy. Okay, then you do the symbol search I busted out earlier. Okay, so in that one, they look at, there we go, 2 symbols, and then they have to just say if either one is over here. And there are, I believe, 3 pages of them that they get 2 minutes to try to go through. Again, never had anyone finish it. Then, remember when we did number sequencing? Then there's letter number sequencing, where they have to, you give them a string of letters and numbers, and they have to put them in numerical order and then alphabetical order. So, for example, for T9A3, it'd be 39AT. Yeah, that one's tough too. All right, and then the one everyone was glad that they got rid of because, I mean, this one was optional and very few people bothered to give it because it was, again, such a pain in the tuchus. There are puzzle pieces, and you have to lay them out in an exact pattern that's on the administration and scoring manual. So I'll give you an example here. So like it shows you exactly how to lay out these pieces. And then you have to, hopefully have them put them together. And then you grade them on how well they did it. Yeah, I think I only ever gave this to my husband. I never gave it to a client because our neuropsych person who supervised me on my assessments was like, no, you don't need to give that one. And I was like, oh, gee, thanks, that's helpful. All right, so that's every subscale on the WACE 3. And from the WACE 3, you could get several different indices. Indices? I don't know. And so one of those is the processing speed index. And that measures essentially how quickly you work, how quickly you can process things. Thanks. Shove that in here too. Awesome. So this is coding and symbol search. So those long things where they time you for 2 minutes and see how far you get. So as with all the other intelligence tests, we have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. The subtests themselves have a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of, that's supposed to be 3, not 13. That would make a lot more sense. Like giant standard deviation now. It's rare that you'll look at individual subtest scores unless you're looking for like a very specific, like you think this person might have like dyscalculia, a type of learning disorder that's math focused, right? You might look specifically at the math related ones, but typically you're just looking at the overall. And then the index scores have that mean of 100 and standard deviation of 15 as well. And so the WACE 3 was kind of the transition. Like it still had the old school verbal and performance IQ, even though factor analysis was starting to show like those aren't really things. But at that time, people just understood that. But then it also got to these 4 index scores, which are more typical of how we think about intelligence now. So verbal comprehension, not necessarily verbal IQ, perceptual organization, working memory, and then that processing speed one I just talked about. And each of those has the same mean of 100, standard deviation of 15. So verbal comprehension is measuring crystallized intelligence. It's what you already know. So that's the vocabulary one, where you do definitions. That's similarities, where you say how the words are alike. Information, where you tell us those facts you've learned. And comprehension, where that's the one that is like a little more abstract, but there are still right and wrong answers. It takes out arithmetic and digit span, which were originally in verbal IQ, since you do them out loud. And those seem to consistently in research really load more on attention and working memory rather than your verbal ability. Then there's the Perceptual Organization Index, and this is really thought to be a measure of that fluid intelligence, your ability to solve problems in the moment. And so this requires attention and visual motor integration, and it's got picture completion, block design, and matrix reasoning. So you're having to do something essentially in the moment, build those blocks, mentally complete that picture and matrix reasoning. Incidentally, when we get to talking about the WACE 4 and some of the other modern tests, this was really beefed up. There are a lot more subtests that map onto fluid intelligence. Working memory was new to the WACE 3, and it's the ability to encode information in short-term memory, then manipulate it. So digit span, arithmetic, things along those lines. So again, having to do those math problems in your head is considered a form of working memory. Processing speed is all the time stuff. How quickly can you work, basically? All right, so there are like interpretations you can do, comparisons you can do, and I don't know if anyone flipped this open to that, but these are on this page here. So after you've scored them, you can actually compare these things, and it can give you some indication of things. And this is, by the way, how you score it by hand. You put in like each individual score, and then it tells you what to add up to get the various indices. The beautiful, beautiful thing, which they don't teach you until after you've learned to do this by hand, is that there is computer scoring software. So I remember the first time my like supervisor told me that, I was like, you literally just saved my weekend, because this could take a really long time to do by hand, especially when you're new at it. And whereas the software does it in about 30 seconds. Here's our friend, the normal curve, right? So it's got like standard scores on there, IQ index scores, and it gives you broad generalizations of terms. So any IQ that's between 90 and 110 is average, for example. Then you get to high average, superior, very superior. Oh gosh, that converted really strangely in Google Slides. So, but basically, it had a pretty good standardization sample, almost 2,500 adults, 13 age groups going from, I believe, 18 to 30, all the way up to 70 plus. The reliabilities are really good. They tried to get gender, race, education, geographical region in there. The standard error of the mean is really small here, which is really good. You want that on these good tests. And then validity coefficients in the 0.9. So the reliabilities are in the 0.9s as well. So that's really good. That's what you want. Again, for something that you might be making really major decisions for that person about, right? How intelligent they are might determine whether they go to a gifted class or not, for example. All right, so the WAIS-4 was like, we're done with this transition, and they got rid of those verbal and performance IQs. They're like, research doesn't support this, let's just chuck it, basically. So they were using essentially those indices that they started with the WAIS-3, and they rearranged them so that like there's like a core of the WAIS now that's like you have to get this to get the indices essentially and the overall IQ. But then there's optional ones, and all those are at the end now. It used to be the optional ones were kind of like sprinkled through. So that makes it a lot easier for giving it. There's new items, including more difficulty. Sometimes they were running into like what they call a ceiling effect, where in general, like a college educated person would get most or all of them right on some of the subtests. There's new scoring, new administration. There was also a new representative sample. Like I said, they did away with object assembly. Huzzah. So this is the WAIS-4. So yes, Wesleyan bought this for me, which I'm very grateful because I wasn't going to be able to afford it. And so this has a technical manual that tells you all the fun stuff about reliability and validity we've talked about before. We've got our good old administration and scoring manual that does the same thing. Love that technology. I remember one time I taught this class and I had someone who had been a psychometrician, which is someone who like gives races and then they give the scoring sheets to a psychologist who interprets them. And she had never known it did that. She was like, oh my God. She was so bad that she'd been not doing that for all those years. And there are a few new tests here. Pretty much everything is the same, just with new items. But the new tests I will tell you about are figure weights. So this is like matrix reasoning, only it's a little more complicated. So It's, you're trying to balance the scales, essentially. I'll show it to our online folks. And so like this one, a circle and a square seem to be equal. So we got two circles, we should have two squares. That's pretty easy, right? But they get more complicated and essentially require you to do mental math as you get higher. And so this is one of those things that's a measure of fluid intelligence. They just realized we don't really have enough of those. Picture completion. So like our barn we just looked at is now only about halfway through. And there are more after that now. That used to be the last one. So they continue to make it more difficult, essentially. Other ones here. I guess they were finding some people who did. And so they wanted to have more variability above that, basically. Because it was like, essentially, you know, you'll hear people be like, my IQ is 300. Like the waist can't give you an IQ of 300. It kind of tops out at, I think, like 185. So I think this might allow it to go a little bit above that. So, but yeah, it was sort of like, what? If you weren't doing it anyway, what? So we've still got block design, we've still got matrix reasoning, we've still got vocabulary. The arithmetic now has some items for people who need to go backwards, where they actually have visual things. And then we have visual puzzles, which is kind of like matrix reasoning, but again, a little more complex. You have to like put pieces together to make this. Again, a measure of fluid intelligence. How well can you problem solve a type of thing you might have never seen before? The record form is pretty similar. Now, in addition to the response booklet for symbol search, where you cross them out if there's one there, now there's also something called cancellation. And this is really a measure of attention. So you're supposed to mark through the symbol, but only if a red square precedes a yellow triangle. Not if they're alone, not if it's a yellow square preceded by a red triangle. So it's very much about, can you pay attention to these two things happening in sequence? This is a version of a test for ADHD, actually. So we had one that was actually computerized we used to give people, where it was like letters. They had to, I don't remember, it was like F before L or something, say, and only hit a button if it was that. And if they did well, the computerized one would actually go fast to see, like, can they keep up? So, yes, updated waste for, and I think I mentioned before, they did this like my last year that I was actually at my grad school. So it's like really, so I learned how to give it, but I've actually never given this whole thing, which is a little sad because I like the new subtests for sure. So I thought I might have to give it on residency, but I ended up not having to. So the goals of this revision were to update the theoretical foundations, start to get more at, you know, developmental things in terms of aging, going from, you know, 18 to your 30s. You still have your brain developing until you're about 25, especially your prefrontal cortex. So, you know, you kind of trying to account for some of that. Make it more user-friendly for the clinician, make it even more useful clinically, and make those reliability and validity scores even better. Now, the really interesting thing here is, again, we've done away with what had existed for almost 100 years before this, the verbal and performance IQs, right? Checked those, and now we have this verbal comprehension inventory, which we started in WASTE 3, right? So it's got similarities, vocabulary, and information. Interestingly now, comprehension, the like analogies and what do you do in common situations, is a supplemental. You don't have to give it, but if you do, it can go on this index. The performance related, I'm going to forget the actual term, but it's in your slides earlier. But this one is block design, matrix reasoning, and visual puzzles. And then figure weights and picture completion are your supplementals here. You can see you can give the whole waist with about 12 subscales now. And then it's just if you feel like you need more information, you'll give the supplemental ones. So digit span, arithmetic are on the working memory, which is they were before, but now your supplemental one is letter number sequencing. And then the processing speed one, symbol search and coding, the two things where you have paper in front of you that you are from the waist 3, but that new cancellation one is supplemental. But obviously, if you're thinking this is someone who may be having trouble with processing speed, you're going to want to make sure you give it. So you can see there's less overlap now between things as well, to make each of these indices more of like a pure measure of just that, which is nice. A lot of, we'll talk about this when we get to personality tests too. A lot of early tests were just sort of like, use the items wherever. And more modern psychologists and neuropsychologists have been like, let's make these as clean as possible so we don't have overlap and it's not like confusing, and maybe measuring the same thing with 3 different scales. Scoring here, we only have full scale IQ. And again, this is 3. I don't know why I keep saying 13 here. There we go. And then the index scores again have the 100 with the standard deviation of 15, just like the full scale IQ. So verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. It says not organization here because it was called perceptual organization on the waist 3. So they sort of refine the subtest names. Now, really interesting thing about the waist 3 and 4 is that even though Wechsler developed these scales for adults initially, he actually, or it's not him, I think he's actually probably deceased by now. The people who keep his company going have actually updated the WISC, the children's version, before him. So a lot of the changes that were made to the WAIS 4 had been out for several years on the WISC 4, and it sort of followed that trend. And I don't know why that is, if it's just the WISC gets used more frequently, or they feel the need to really keep it up to date for things like gifted programs and important decisions that are made for kiddos. But okay, so we'll continue talking about this on Wednesday, and then we'll start talking about other neuropsych assessments.